I'm Pouya Alimagham. I'm an Iranian, born in Iran, raised in the United States. That's important, I guess, part of the backdrop to this book in a way. I teach modern Middle East history at MIT. This past semester, I taught part-time for the first time at Boston University in person during COVID, and that was a wonderful experience nonetheless. But yeah, this book, Contesting the Iranian Revolution, the Green Uprisings, was my PhD dissertation that I wrote and I finished in 2015, and been working on it ever since.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for talking with us today. And I should add that your dissertation won an award as well at the Association of Iranian Studies conference back in 2016, I believe.
That's right.
So congratulations for that, and
Thank you.
congratulations for the book. It's a very important book, and I'm very excited to talk about it with you today.
Me too. Thank you.
Teaching in person must have been quite something in COVID,
Uh,
no
it,
less.
I think the first couple meetings were a little bit anxious ridden, but there's nothing like being in the classroom, I guess, even under these circumstances.
That's
So
true.
it was still a very wonderful and positive experience, and it panned out well. BU took a lot of measures to make sure everyone was safe, and it really worked out in the long
Oh,
term.
well done for that. And this book came out during the pandemic. Is that right?
During the very first lockdown.
Wow,
Yeah.
it's a good thing to come out of the pandemic then, at least.
Yeah, initially I was a little bit, I couldn't believe it that I had, because this book started as a seminar paper in 2010 and it evolved into a
Wow.
dissertation, then it evolved into a book. So I had been working on it more or less for 10 years. And then when it
Mhm.
finally came out, obviously it was a non-essential item. So people who had pre-ordered it weren't
Right,
getting it. And I understood, obviously.
of course.
But people are now, I think some people are engaging with it, which is really what any author cares about. No
Mm.
one writes the book for the royalties. We want people, this is an important history to us. We want
Yeah,
people to read it.
absolutely.
And so
Absolutely.
I appreciate this opportunity to
Oh,
talk with you and the Iranian Studies Collective about the book.
thank you so much. It's great to have you. And perhaps that's where we can sort of start is why you decided to write the book. The Green Movement protest is very important, but for you, what was the reason behind that?
I think there was two reasons. One was my entire interest in academia began with the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79. I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. I took a course called the Iranian Revolution and its impact on the Middle East. It was a poli-sci course, and I was that kid who sat in the front of the classroom writing down everything the professor said verbatim.
Oh, wow.
He was not a permanent faculty member, just like I'm not
Okay.
permanent at MIT.
Hmm.
And so that class wasn't offered. And Berkeley is one of the few schools where an undergraduate, an undergraduate who gets a tenured faculty member and a chair from the same department to sign off on your course can institute their own course.
I
So
see.
without pay, and
Right.
without being able to offer grades, but for pass no pass semester units. So
I
I ended
see.
up teaching that course. Um,
Wow.
I was always very stage fright, didn't like speaking in front of audiences, but I just loved this material so much. And this is
Mm.
immediately post 9/11. And I thought it
Wow.
would be a travesty for Iranians and Americans to go through their undergraduate education and not be exposed to this material. So I taught
Hmm.
it one semester. I had 30 students. It was a success. And then I taught it again. I had 60. I taught it again, and I had 70. And then I
Wow.
graduated. So yeah, and the interest was very much there with me as well. I
Hmm.
was the Iranian Revolution became very much I don't want to say obsession, but it kind of was. And so when the uprising happened in 2009, um,
Mm.
and the manner in which they harnessed the symbolism of the Iranian Revolution. So this is an uprising that
Mm.
happened in 2009, 30 years after the revolution, but the
Mm.
uprising
Oh,
used
yeah.
so much of the imagery, symbols, discourses, and
Mm.
ideology of that revolution to protest against the outcome of the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian government itself, the Islamic
Hmm.
Republic. So um, there was that. like the Iranian Revolution was present in a way in the uprising. That
Mm.
got me interested in it, and also the uprising itself.
Yeah,
Just it was just ingenious the manner in which they launched it, sustained it
mm.
for months after the full
That's
scale
true.
crackdown was
Mm.
implemented, um, and I kind of connected with the people,
Yeah.
the young, the youth, the students, the men and
Mm.
the women who were in it, and I also wasn't excited about the way the uprising was being talked about in
Yeah.
commentaries and in the media. They talked about, well, obviously the way the Iranian government presented it. I wasn't excited
Hmm.
about that. They presented it as a conspiracy from the West,
Yeah.
which is kind of like this tendency in Iranian politics, or maybe in a lot of politics,
Hmm.
where people who were opposed to the Iranian Revolution, who are now part of the diaspora, the Iranian
Right.
diaspora, especially
Yeah.
where I grew up in Southern California, they present the Iranian Revolution, those millions who marched for it, as being part of this, American conspiracy to overthrow the Shah, which is
Right.
insane and ridiculous, and no
Hmm.
serious academic takes it seriously. But then the flip
Right.
side then is then the Iranian government tried to present the uprising against it in 2009 as a part of another conspiracy, which just
Interesting.
robs the
Mm.
Iranians of their agency. So
No.
I
Right.
felt I felt like it was important to push back against those very dehumanizing, because when you say you're part of, when you present an uprising as part of a
Hmm.
conspiracy, you're essentially
Hmm.
saying these are agents of imperialism, and
Yeah.
therefore they're traitors, and cracking down on them is justified. So it's very
Mm.
dehumanizing, and I wanted to humanize the people who were in this uprising
Yeah.
in
Very important.
2009. There's a lot of reasons why I decided. I also wasn't excited about the rhetoric about how the movement was over. It was a failure. There was a lot
Right.
of that talk, right? Because
That's true.
it was born of the election results,
Yes.
the Ahmadinejad's so-called election win, and it
Hmm.
continued on and off for about 6-7 months, and
Hmm.
then it received like a nail in the coffin,
Yeah.
proverbial nail in the coffin, on Revolution Day in February 11, 2010. And then the government hailed the defeat of the uprising. A
Mm.
lot of people in the uprising, kind of accepted that rhetoric. They thought it was a defeat. A lot of the Western media talked about it as a failure. And
Mm.
I thought, actually, first of all, it's not over. It has
No.
pollinated post 2009 uprisings and protests. And also, it wasn't a failure. It may have
No.
not abrogated the election results. It may have not overthrown the system that ratified those election
Mm.
results, but it had many successes, which is, essentially one of the main points of the book.
Yeah. And regional impact, I suppose, as well, because this was the time of the Arab Spring. Do you see a connection with that as well in the book?
Yeah, so it predates the Arab Spring by 2 years. Before there was a Tahrir Square in Cairo, there was
Yeah.
Meiduna Azadi,
Hmm.
Freedom Square in Tehran. That was one of the main focal points of the Green Uprising. Um, the connectivity is a little bit, it's not as tenuous. It's not
Hmm.
that strong, mainly because the uprising began in Tunisia and then it
Yeah.
spread to Egypt. But we know that um, when the uprising was happening in 2009, this is very much in the conclusion of the book. When it was
Hmm.
happening in 2009, activists in countries like Egypt were looking to Iran for inspiration.
Mm. Mm.
Egypt and Iran have not had relations since the Iranian Revolution,
Right.
and so Egyptians kind of, from what I understood, based on what Egyptians told me, they are raised in an educational system that kind of
Mm.
presents Iran as foreign to the region. They don't really
Right.
know much
Yes.
about it,
Right.
um, and
Mm.
so these activists who tuned into the uprising before the Arab Spring in Iran hoped that it would win, not because they were conditioned to hate the Iranian government, but because they hoped that if the uprising was able to bring down Ahmadinejad's presidency or the government as a whole, then that would become an exemplar for action in Egypt.
Right.
And obviously, they
Hmm.
didn't get that exemplar for action in Iran. They ended up getting it
Mm.
in Tunisia, but they
Yes.
adopted a lot of the tactics. So they still learn
Hmm.
things from it.
Like the use of social
social
media, I imagine
media.
those kind of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
The use of social media in the uprising in Iran was very overblown, but there's still
Mm.
tactics that they were able to, adopt, right?
Draw on.
The
Yeah.
idea is that social media was much more important to coordinating action in the Arab Spring, but
Hmm.
what was really interesting to the uprising in 2009 was 30 years prior, the Iranian Revolution is told as the first televised revolution in
Yeah.
the modern period, right? The
Hmm.
Green Uprising is the first socially broadcast revolution. So,
Yes.
when all
Yes.
these
Yes.
international journalists were invited to leave the country post-election, during the crisis, the idea was that the government wanted these journalists out to not be able to document what was about to happen with
What's
the
happening?
crackdown.
Yeah.
When there's
Hmm.
not a lot of eyes or not a lot of
Hmm.
documentation, governments are freer to repress.
Of
But
course.
that's what's really interesting about 2009 is that because of digital, not digital cameras, but phones that had cameras on them. They
Yes.
weren't smartphones because smartphones
No, that's right.
had come out a few years before 2009 in the US, but they
Hmm.
hadn't quite reached Iran in 2009 yet. But
Right.
people were able to, with their flip phones, document the
That's true.
repression, the violence, the killing of
Hmm.
the poster girl of the uprising, that the Agha
Hmm.
Sultan, and they were able to
Hmm.
broadcast their uprising to the world. And that was really
Hmm.
fascinating because CNN
Mm.
didn't have journalists in Iran, but was able to
No.
take this very grainy, pixelated footage
Mm.
and then broadcast that footage to the world. So um,
Right.
so it was really important
Fascinating.
to
Mm.
garner this like global audience, and this that was important to the revolution in 79. It was even more important in 2009.
Wow, it's fascinating. Well, thank you. And you talked about this earlier a little bit about how it started off as a seminar paper and it became your dissertation and now a book. But maybe we can talk a little bit about the research journey. And I suppose you relied on interviews and
Yeah.
newspapers. But what else did you? What was that? What was the research journey like for you?
Well, um, the book is very much about both the Iranian Revolution
Hmm.
and the uprising in 2009. Hence the
Right.
title,
Yes.
contesting the Iranian Revolution, the
Yeah.
Green Uprising. So
Yes.
the sources for the Iranian Revolution, a lot of
Hmm.
them are archival and stuff like that. The
Of
sources
course.
for the uprising in 2009,
Mm.
um, to my advisor's credit, Huang Ko, when you're doing a history book on something that's so present, like
Yes.
2009, and mind you, it was a seminar paper in 2010 that evolved
Hmm.
into a 2015 dissertation. So
Hmm.
it was very even more fresh back then when I began working
Hmm.
on it. Um, I had to, argue my methodology.
Yeah,
And
that's
Huang
interesting.
Ko, yeah, so I was like, Abrahamian, Yerbanda Abrahamian, the
Hmm.
foremost historian of modern Iran, and yeah, of course,
No, it's
in his
just
book on the
respect.
respect,
Respect.
in
Yeah. Yeah.
his 2000 and I think it's a 2013 book on the coup,
Oh,
on the U.S.
1953 coup. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, in the
Yeah.
1953 coup, the U.S.
Yeah,
overthrow
you're
of the
right.
Iranian
Yeah.
government, the Mossadegh government. In that book, he argues about how the U.S. government does not respect its own 30-year rule. So,
Mm.
6 decades after the coup, he was still unable to get the diplomatic cables from the
Mm.
1953 coup. And
Mm.
so if we're going to have to wait for
Yeah.
these diplomatic cables to
Mm.
be declassified to write this history,
Hmm.
we'd have to write this book in 2050 or
30.
60 or 70.
Yeah. Mm.
So one of the things that was very useful to the book were those WikiLeaks cables. um, so I
Fascinating.
was able to
Yeah.
use a lot of these diplomatic cables. And of course, there's no U.S. embassy in Iran anymore.
Right. Yes.
So the U.S. embassy in Ankara and the consulate in Istanbul and the embassy in Dubai are just a treasure trove of information.
Wow.
And
Right.
it almost, if you read the cables, you kind of see, you see why almost the Iranian government in 1979 accused the U.S. embassy as a den of
Den of
spies.
spies.
Yeah, nest of spies, because it's a lot of
Same,
intelligence
right.
gathering, and
Of
so
course.
that was a
Yeah.
treasure trove. And then, like I said, it was the first
Fascinating.
socially broadcast revolution.
Yeah.
So uh, all their footage from major
Mm,
events is on YouTube. A lot of this footage has
amazing.
since
Yeah,
come
that's
down
true.
because it's
Yeah.
incriminating, right? Whoever
Hmm.
uploaded it is essentially saying I was there to film it.
Yeah.
So a lot of this stuff has come down, but I was able to, because I worked on this in 2009, I was able to download it and archive everything, with the
Oh,
original
wow.
header, the original description, the original update,
Useful. Wow.
upload, the original upload date, even the person or the IDs that uploaded it. All this stuff
Of
is
course.
there. Some of these videos are still there. And when you watch these videos, this is like a window into those events, and you get to
Mm,
see the strategies, what they
mm,
were
hmm.
wearing, because the color of the protest
That's
movement
true.
was
Yeah.
there.
Hmm. Hmm.
Their slogans are very important. Their
Hmm.
tactics, the
Hmm.
repression, and so you're able to assess it. And this is very much a history from below approach. This isn't like a
Mm,
diplomatic history. This is not
no.
a history of great men. It's not a history about
No, it's a
Khomeini or
nice.
anything like
Yeah.
that.
No, no. That's
So
good.
we're looking about
Mm.
the people who were on the ground. This isn't a book about Musavi, the
No.
figurehead of the opposition. This is a book about those women and men on the ground who made this history. And so
Yeah.
we're very much seeing it through their eyes
Mm.
when we use those, those videos, which is in a way
Mm.
a new form of archival data.
Mm. No, it's a good lesson for historians, I think, in order to write contemporary history. I mean, there is a way to do that, to apply historical methods to something that's quite recent. No, that's
Yeah.
fascinating.
So, I mean, my challenge as a Iranian in the U.S. was to, make sure that, first of all, the sources are Iranian sources,
Right.
Persian language sources, but also
Of
Iranian.
course.
So they're not like BBC Persian. They're not
No, right. Hmm.
Voice of America. They're not like U.S. government or British funded Persian language
Right.
sources.
Of
And then
course.
also to make sure that those activists themselves are present. So
Mm.
there was controversies throughout this uprising. Like one was on Jerusalem Day, Yom Al Quds, on
Mm.
September 18, 2009, where they came out and they said, Na Gaza, na Lebanon, Janam Fadaya Iran. No to Gaza, no to Lebanon. My life is only for Iran. And
Mm.
that was very controversial. There was a lot of pushback. Mousavi himself pushed back about it. The Iranian
Hmm.
government took that as evidence as being part of this Israeli conspiracy. Um, but then the activists who aired those slogans then penned why those slogans were aired. So they explained it themselves, in Persian
Mm.
language, opposition websites. They explained it. So that's part of, it's their story in a way.
Yeah.
And then there was other trends. Most people don't know this. On Jerusalem Day, there was the negating of Palestine to negate the Iranian
Mm.
government that
Right.
legitimates itself by
Of
championing
course.
its liberation. But
Yeah.
also there was the appropriation of Palestine. So then there was another strand within
Ah.
those activists on Jerusalem Day that basically used the government's discourse, self-legitimating discourse of Palestinian liberation to say, Madam chera neshastin, Iran shode Palestine.
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
people, why are you sitting? Iran has become Palestine. Basically, underscoring that if the Iranian government for the past 30 years has trained us or drilled us to think that Palestinians are oppressed, and they are oppressed, and the Israelis are their
Mm.
oppressors, well, and that's a bad thing. Oppression is a
Hmm.
bad thing. Occupation is a bad thing. The usurpation of power is a bad thing. All those like Palestine discourses,
Hmm.
they now were now equating the Iranian government with a usurper of power and
Yeah,
themselves as oppressed alongside the
that's
Palestinians. So you
fascinating.
saw all these
Yeah.
different things, and they explained it all themselves. So this isn't me kind of like imposing meaning, my own meaning
Mm.
onto these events. They put pen to paper and cleared everything up for people to
Mm.
read.
Fascinating. And you actually have a chapter on this, I think,
A
contesting
whole chapter
Palestine.
on it. Absolutely.
Exactly. No, that's fascinating. Yeah, no, I look forward to reading it. I must confess that I've only read the introduction, but I will get through it. It's very
Yeah, we
very
talked
important.
earlier, and I mentioned to you, in my opinion, and this is important if anyone who watches this is going to read it. The introduction is important. It lays the groundwork
Yes,
for the book. It's like the
right.
key to understanding the book, but the most important chapters, the most interesting, in my opinion, come after.
Sure, of course. I know, but it's a good
So,
teaser, I think. It's a good teaser.
okay.
Yeah, no, that's good. But yes, it's fascinating that that's such a huge part of the protest movements. I wasn't very aware of that. And I suppose, I mean, when you were writing this book, what were the main surprises for you? Was this something that you discovered that you didn't expect to?
I think that one thing I'll say there's one surprise and one thing I really loved about doing this work, because it's writing a book, especially a book that's you have to research to the T. It's a labor of love.
Sure.
And one thing I loved about doing it was that the protest in 2009 went back in history. Like, in order to
Mm,
understand it, you got to go back to Iran's history.
sure.
If you're only looking at it through the prism of 2009, you're only going to scratch the surface of it,
Yeah.
right? To go back, you got to go back to the revolution to really understand the impact of 2009.
Mm,
But
hmm.
what I also really enjoyed about it
Interesting.
was that you also have to transcend Iran. Like, the protests happened in Iran, within Iran's
Hmm.
borders, but there's so much history that's important to understanding 2009 and the protests in Iran that extends beyond Iran's border, like Palestinian liberation, like the history of
Yeah.
Shiism. You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Yeah.
So there's just so
Mm,
you have to have a panoramic to really kind of decode 2009. The
yeah.
thing that surprised me um,
Interesting.
was learning that the movement wasn't over. Everyone thinks of it, like I said earlier, as a
Yeah.
failure, as
Yeah.
it's over, and
Mm,
I was able to um, demonstrate through the activism of Iranians themselves post 2009 how the movement has not only not ended, but has pollinated other protest movements.
hmm.
So I remember when I think it was, yeah, when Hassan Rouhani was first elected
Right.
to the
Hmm.
presidency in 2010 or 2013. One of the slogans in the celebration to mark his win was "Jomish Sabz namorde Rouhani ro avorde." The Green Movement is not dead; it has brought Rouhani to power. I mean, the
Yeah.
rhythm of it gets lost in translation.
Mm,
It's so much better in
mm.
Persian.
I agree.
جنبش سبز نمرد روحانی رو آورده.
Yeah.
So you see
Absolutely.
the continuity in
Mm,
so many
that's
events that
fascinating.
happened
Yeah.
post 2009, from the
Hmm.
Arab Spring itself 2 years later, because
Hmm.
that's when Musavi, Karoubi, and Rahnavard, the figureheads of the movement, were placed under house arrest
Yeah.
because they tried to use the momentum of the Arab Spring to
Hmm.
demonstrate in solidarity against tyranny. So they weren't trying to make it about the Iranian government,
Yeah.
but they were trying to like
Hmm.
harness the momentum of the Arab Spring to reignite their
Hmm.
movement against tyranny. But everyone knew what that
Yeah.
meant. They were trying to revitalize it against the Iranian government, and that's when they were
Of
placed on
course.
house arrest. So
Right.
the movement supposedly ended in early 2010, but then they were placed under house arrest in 2011. Rouhani was brought to
Mm.
power and he won elections in 2013 when we heard that slogan.
Hmm.
The Iran nuclear accord was signed in 2015. You still heard those slogans. Rafsanjani died in 2000 and I think
Yes.
maybe 17, and you heard Green
Mm.
Movement slogans during his funeral processions. And
Mm. So
then
it
the protests that
continues.
the
Mm.
and then the protests that happened in 2000 and late 2017, early 2018
Yeah.
had nothing
Yeah.
to do with elections or the Green Movement
No.
or anything like that. But
No,
you
that's
still
true.
heard stuff like "Nagaz and Nalo Nanjana Fadai," a lot of Green Movement slogans that were not being recycled.
Mm. Fascinating. I mean, it's interesting that you can sort of still chart that and that momentum. And today, what do you think about now? I mean, in a way, it's a kind of a faceless movement, or is it something that sort of just is
Yeah,
an
so
undercurrent?
that's one of its strengths,
Yeah.
but also one of its weaknesses, right?
Hmm.
So I go through this in the book as well about how um, excuse me, Rahnavard herself called it a there's this like the Green Movement was an umbrella that anyone who had a beef with the Iranian government was gathering under, right?
Yeah.
Whether they were
Hmm.
women or youth,
Mm-hmm.
members of the LGBTQ community,
Mm-hmm.
religious minorities, Baha'is.
Yeah.
Everyone had a beef, came underneath it.
Mm.
Um, and because it was open, allowed for so many people to get involved, right?
Right.
Literally millions of people, right? Like, people don't want to understand that. But on June
Mm.
15th, 3 days after the election results, just in Tehran, 3 million people literally came out. The government even acknowledged it. The mayor of
Mm-hmm.
Tehran acknowledged it and then brought down that acknowledgement. So it was online and it was removed. But this is also, like I said, one of the interesting things about doing this modern research with modern
Mm-hmm.
research tools, because when the government admitted to that number and brought down that admission, the videos were there to document.
To like
So
to show that, right, that was
in a
there.
pedestrian overpass, someone's there with a camera filming the crowd, and then he turns around and you see a whole nother sea of people behind them.
Wow. Mm.
So
That is incredible, actually.
so what I was saying was so one of the
Yeah.
strengths was that it was able
Yeah.
to invite or allow millions of people to get behind it. But that was
Yeah.
also one of its weaknesses, was that
Mm-hmm.
it didn't have a unified leadership. It didn't have a bona fide ideological alternative that it
Mm-hmm.
presented, right? That's one of the things about the Iranian Revolution, was that
Mm-hmm.
it had a lot of organizations,
Mm-hmm.
but it had one undisputed leader, Ayatollah
Yeah.
Khomeini.
With me, right. Yeah.
Undisputed leader. Like, people
Yeah.
now in the diaspora just do not want to admit that. Undisputed leader,
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
100%.
Everyone got behind
And
him. Yeah.
and he had a blueprint. He had
Yes.
a blueprint of what should replace the monarchy.
Yeah.
A lot of people didn't know about that entire blueprint. The book Hukumat
Mm-hmm.
Islami, Islamic government, was
Yeah.
banned in the country, so
Yeah.
they may not have entirely I don't even think the Islamists understood that blueprint, because there's one thing, I go
Mm.
through this as well in the book, but there's one thing to outline what the government structure should look like. It's quite another thing to then implement it and experience the shortcomings of that blueprint,
Of
theory
course.
versus
Yeah.
praxis.
Right.
So,
Mm-hmm.
um,
That's
but still, nonetheless,
yeah.
that's the strength of why the revolution succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
Was because the opposition was very organized, very
Yeah.
committed,
Yeah.
had a unified leadership structure, had a
Mm-hmm.
presented the alternative.
Yes.
And then the flip side, 2009, no real unified leadership. Like, Musavi
Mm-hmm.
himself was not calling the shots. This is also one reason why I did a bottom up history from below approach, was because a lot of the times the events took Musavi by surprise. A
Yeah.
lot of a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
Green Movement events post elections took Musavi by surprise. Um, so there was no real unified structure. There was no real ideological alternative to the Islamic Republic. And then the Islamic Republic itself was different from the Shah. Uh, the Islamic
Of
Republic
course.
was its security apparatus is exponentially more powerful than the Shah's ever was.
Mm-hmm.
And then the
Yes.
government itself it does have roots in the country. Like, the Shah
Yeah.
was
That's
somebody
true.
who, wore a
Mm-hmm.
tie, spoke English, spoke
Mm-hmm.
French,
Yeah.
was
Quite a
educated in
stranger in this
Europe.
country in a
Yeah,
way. Yeah.
he was very much, backed by the United
Mm.
States, installed by the United
Yeah.
States,
Yeah.
sustained by the United States. Whereas the Iranian government it's from the country,
Mm.
and it reaches deep into the country.
Right. Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
has perfected the security apparatus. So,
Of course.
we historians talk about the Shah as like a one bullet solution. You assassinate the Shah, the structure could collapse, the government structure could collapse.
Mm-hmm.
When Khomeini passed away, there was a
Yeah.
smooth transition of power.
That's true.
And when Khamenei passes away, he's in his early 80s. I'm pretty certain they've already got it all figured out behind the
Yeah.
scenes, like Ibrahim
Yeah.
Raisi
Sure.
or somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So whether
Mm.
it's not gonna be every when Khomeini passed away in '89 and Khamenei took power. I mean, there was a huge difference between Khomeini and Khamenei.
Yeah.
Khomeini legitimated the system,
Mm-hmm.
and then now the system was legitimating Khamenei.
Yes,
Whoever
that's true.
succeeds Khamenei won't have, just like Khamenei didn't have the same legitimacy that Khomeini did. Whoever
Mm-hmm.
succeeds Khamenei won't have the same legitimacy either. Like, Khamenei was somebody who was president during the 80s, during the Iranian Iraq
That's true.
War.
Yeah.
He was very
Mm-hmm.
close to Khomeini.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't, it's going to be a different thing. And that's another point of the Green Movement as well, too. Uh, it may have failed in abrogating Ahmadinejad's election or the system that ratified it,
Mm-hmm.
but it succeeded in robbing the government of a lot of its sources of legitimation. It is a
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
shell of its former self in
Yeah.
terms of
That's
its
interesting.
ideological
Mm.
strengths.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how things pan out when the day arrives, I think. When
I
Khamenei
do
eventually.
I do want to take this time. I do want to take this time. I try to do this everywhere. It's in the preface of the book too, to
Hmm.
just remind people that no matter one's individual politics,
Hmm.
Iran is a sovereign country,
Yeah.
and the future of Iran belongs to Iranians, not
Hmm.
to the U.S. government.
No.
As somebody who wrote this book in the United States, I feel very obligated to make that point.
That's fair
There's a
enough.
lot of
Yeah.
Iranians from my community, from which I come, who think President Trump, and I hope they won't think that way about Biden, who think that the solution to Iran's future, or Iran's future, should be determined by the United States.
No.
And it
Hmm.
very much shouldn't be. The United States has a
Mm.
terrible track record in Iran.
It does. Yeah.
Terrible. From the overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953 to helping to establish this Iran
Right.
secret police, Savak,
Yeah.
to supporting Saddam in the Iran-Iraq War.
Mm. It's a good
But also
reminder.
beyond Iran,
Mm.
but also beyond
Mm.
Iran in the region as a whole, the United States does
Mm.
not have a good track.
No, it's an understatement. But yes, and I think, well, the United States not doing so well at the moment anyway. So I think,
No.
if anything, it should intervene in its own country and sort itself out. But
Get
no,
your
thank
house
you.
in
That's
order
a
first.
exactly. That's a good reminder, though. Thank you so much for all of that. And perhaps as a way to sort of tie everything together, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about the book's contribution and where you see the book.
There's just so many people. I obviously, like, for anyone who, these books are partially autobiographical, right? So I'm
Mm.
not actually
Yeah.
present in the book beyond the introduction, and that's only when I'm making a disclaimer.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a deeply personal book, deeply personal history. So I want as many people to read it as possible, obviously.
Of course.
But I think the people that come to mind, um, first of all, I think Americans need to read it. They don't need to be experts in the Middle East.
No.
I tried to write it in a manner that's accessible, it's comprehensive, so
Yeah.
it could, Americans who are reading about Iran could leave finish the book with a good introduction to
Mm.
modern Iranian history.
Yeah.
I
No.
think
I
that
can see that.
Americans need to learn more about the Middle East because we're
Mm-hmm.
so heavily involved with all our military bases and interventions and all that.
Sure.
Um, but I also think Iranians, I would love for Iranians to read it as well,
Yeah.
especially those who have a gripe with Islam because of the things
Mm.
that the Iranian government has done in its name.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
That's interesting.
and that's really one of the arguments against an Islamic government that are made by clergy in Iran today, that
Mm.
Islam is too grand to be confined to the mundane realities and trappings of a
Mm-hmm.
state, especially when
Mm-hmm.
that state does things,
Mm-hmm.
commits misdeeds, sometimes whole scale misdeeds in the name
Mm-hmm.
of that religion.
Yeah.
So,
Mm. Okay.
I remember when I was a graduate student at Harvard, I was sitting with a convert to Islam.
Okay.
And he was a white American male who was raised in Egypt, and
Okay.
he had converted to Islam. He had been a Muslim for like 15 years. He was in his like late 20s at the time. And we were having lunch at the graduate dining hall with an Iranian who was raised in Iran.
Okay.
And she said something kind of bigoted towards Islam. And in
Mm-hmm.
Persian, I told her, I was like, well, our friend here is a Muslim.
Yeah.
And I said it in Persian, kind of like not to create a situation. And she looks
Yeah.
to him in English and was like, "You're a Muslim?" And he's like, "Yes." And she's like, "Why in God's sake are you a Muslim?"
Oh
And then
dear.
he's like, "For God's sake."
Yeah. Ah,
And
that's
and
interesting.
he wasn't offended. She was
No.
incredibly offensive, but he wasn't
Mm-hmm.
offended because he understood that she experienced a certain
Certain
reality
kind of
as a
course.
woman being raised in Iran.
Yeah.
And that's not all women who experience that reality.
Of course.
It was her reality, and when I'm in no
Sure.
position to deny it.
Of
But
course.
I hope people like that would read this book and
Mm.
see that Islam can be used to legitimate a state, but it could also be used to legitimate an uprising against that state. Like
Yes,
that, Islam is
interesting.
it's not just a belief system, but it's a set of symbols, it's a
Yeah, of
discourse, it's
course.
fluid, and people do things in its name all day and all night.
Hmm.
And that's
Yeah.
more their shortcomings than the shortcomings of the religion. And I'm telling you this to you as someone who is not a pious Muslim, right?
No, I think that's fine. I mean, but I
Yeah,
find that very very interesting because it's actually the first time I've heard someone sort of try and address that the
yeah,
role of Islam, because sometimes when we look at modern Iran, the religion somehow has, and the faith itself and the spiritual aspects of it is somehow no longer in the picture.
mm,
And we get a brand of Islam that's very, very different from one that's, like the belief system
yeah.
itself.
It's very
But
state centric, right?
exactly.
And that's what I
Anything,
tried to do.
yeah, and anything that's sort of imposed on you is going to put you off after a little while. I come from
Yeah,
Malaysia, where Sunni Islam, on the flip side, is literally spoon fed to every Muslim child,
mm,
and a
mm,
very certain kind of Sunni Islam. And of course, it's going to make you, you know, um, the reality is that you can feel quite subdued by that. So I can understand that some people's
yeah,
realities are such.
yeah,
But as you rightly said, that it's important to know that Islam can be used for other things. I mean, it is also used if a leader is delegitimized. Islam allows for one to for that leader to be overthrown. So
mm, yeah.
it's also very much religion of the opposition sometimes.
Absolutely. I would also add that if anyone is interested in Palestinian liberation,
Oh yes, okay,
they
yeah.
would also be interested in this book.
Hmm.
Hopefully, they would read it. I remember I had a another Iranian friend who was raised in Iran who just had a lot of antipathy towards the Palestinians because just like Sunni Islam was shoved down your throats in Malaysia,
Yes,
Palestinian liberation was shoved
yes,
down her throat. So she
yeah.
and she just loathed it because of it.
Mm,
And then
fair
I
enough.
had to explain the green movement. This is well before I wrote the book. I had to explain like
Mm,
how if you think the Palestinians are, if you think Iranians have experienced injustice, that should make you more susceptible to empathizing with the Palestinians. And this is
mm,
what happened actually
mm,
in 2009, I told her.
mm,
And then
mm.
just that conversation completely made her think about the Palestinians in a
Interesting.
very different way. So
Yeah,
I think that's important.
fascinating.
And anyone
Yes.
who's interested in women's movements in the Middle East as well,
Hmm.
because I was doing this from a history from below approach,
Hmm. Yeah.
women are very important to this story. So women and
Mm.
gender are important to the story. We see it surface so much in the movement, not just by women's participation, not only by Zahra Rahnavar's leadership of the movement, but also like you see a lot of gender themes show up in the movement. Like
Mm.
they try to symbolically castrate
Gosh.
one of the protest leaders in December 7th
Right.
because they photographed him wearing a hijab by saying
Ah.
that, oh, he was trying to evade this supposed courageous activist. We caught him trying to evade our personnel by wearing this woman's garment. And that wasn't true. They put that on him and took a photo of him and posted it on Iranian media to embarrass him. But
Mm.
what kind of reaction that provoked, and all the symbolism loaded in taking this garment that you think is all about virtue and now using it as a weapon, by
Hmm.
men, using it a weapon that men have
Interesting.
mandated for women to wear in Iran because the hijab is
Hmm.
mandated in Iran.
Of course.
Men have mandated it, and now I've weaponized it against another man to embarrass him. There's a lot to be
Mm,
said about it.
fascinating. Yeah, of course. No, no, it's good. There's a lot of people should read this book basically, and I'll definitely put a link to the book for those in the UK at
Wonderful.
the end of this video. But I'm thank you so much for your time today, Priya. It was amazing. I learned a
It's
lot,
my
and
pleasure.
it's one of the
Absolutely.
reasons why I love to do these videos is because for me personally, I get a free lesson, so it's great.
It was a wonderful time. I appreciate it. I appreciate your
No,
time.